Hi everyone, welcome back to Be Encouraged with Christy. For those of you that are joining for the first time, just a little background on how all this got started. So I've been writing for several years, just small devotions that I would end with the phrase "Be encouraged." I've been doing that for several years, and weren't published, but I would just share them around to certain people in my life. And someone in my close inner circle was having trouble with their vision, and being able to read and would encourage me to put them on a video where they could listen or see, maybe see a little bit better. And so after much struggle, I started doing that about a year ago. So that is the premise of it. It's really focused towards people that are just beginning to study the Bible, or maybe are interested in studying the Bible, or maybe don't have someone to talk to about things that they are studying and learning, or maybe just to encourage someone who's maybe having a little bit of a struggle with their faith or feeling isolated in any way. So that is pretty much what this is. It's not slick. It's not a theological dissertation on something I learned in Bible college. I simply like to read the Word of the Lord. I love the Bible. I love studying, and that is just a passion of mine that somehow is turned into this. And I don't know that it'll ever be any more than what this is, and that's okay. So anyway, I am glad that you all joined me, and we'll just jump right into something that I've been studying about this week. So I was reading, and I was jumping all over the other day, like reading from this passage, that passage. I was even, and I usually when I read I take notes, and I was even struggling to do that. And then I ended up in Luke chapter 10, I believe it is. And I was reading about Mary and Martha, and this is something that I've read about in the past, and I always get something out of this story, but this time something new caught my eye, so I want to share that with you. Let me grab my reading glasses, because we cannot see without these. And I'm going to start in Luke chapter 10, verse 38 and 42. Now it came to pass, as they went, that he entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house, and she had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was cumbered about with much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things, but one thing is needful, and Mary has chosen that good part, which shall not be taken away from her. And so in the book of John, chapter 12, verse 1 through, we'll just say 1 through 3, we see John's perspective on this same instance. When Jesus 6 days before Passover came to Bethany, where Lazarus, which had been dead, whom he raised from the dead, there they made him a supper, and Martha served. But Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. And there are literally like so many sermons that could be preached and lessons that could be taught just from either of those two little passages. So here we have just a recap of Jesus. He's 6 days before Passover. He's coming to the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and he's going to eat with them. And it says in one passage that they prepared him a meal, but Martha served. So Martha was busy with much serving, and then she looks around and she's like, because it was probably a larger group. I get it. If you've ever entertained, it just gets really chaotic. up until everybody finally gets sat down, and then everything kind of comes together. So Martha's running around serving, trying to get everything together, and Mary's sitting at the feet of Jesus. And she asked Jesus, she said, "Can you tell Mary to please come help serve me?" And Jesus said, "Martha, Martha, you're careful and you're so anxious about many things, but there's one thing that's needful, and Mary is doing that good part, that part that can't be taken from her." And then in John, he has a little different perspective. Emphasizes the fact that Lazarus, who has just recently been raised from the dead, is there also. And they made a supper, and Martha served, and Lazarus joined at the table. He makes the point very clear that this man who was once dead is raised and sitting at the table with him. And then it says, Mary took a pound of spikenard ointment and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the scent of spikenard. And we'll bypass the fact that spikenard was incredibly costly, and it was incredibly aromatic. And there's just so many things that can be taught about that, but I'm going to move on. So Mary and Martha illustrate the struggle to balance responsibilities and spiritual growth. That is, to me, like what kind of jumped out at me about this, because I think that's all of our struggle, whether you're a woman that works outside the home, or you are a woman that works inside the home, whether you have children to care for when you get off work, or if you stay at home and care for your children. There's always a struggle to balance the things that pull at you outwardly and drain you inwardly versus the things that fill you inwardly and spiritually. So one of the things that was interesting and that I noticed is that Mary dared to break cultural boundaries and go and sit with the men. First of all, that was not done, but she did it, and kudos to her. But what stood out to me most in this passage was the question that came to my mind: why did Jesus call Martha's name twice? And I've heard people touch on it in saying that it's the equivalent of like when you're in trouble as a kid and your mom calls you by your first name and middle name. And the more I thought about it, I was like, Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. This was the one time that was recorded in Scripture where Jesus wept. And so I'm thinking that in my mind, he wasn't scolding her. There had to be something different. I don't feel like he was scolding her and telling her, Mary's doing right and you're doing wrong, because they needed to eat. They needed sustenance. Somebody had to fix it, had to fix the dinner and serve and make sure that everything was okay. And that was Martha's way of showing that she loved Jesus and that she cared about him, was by making sure everything was perfect. So let's explore the instances where God or his spokesperson, whether it be an angel of the Lord or whatnot, called people's names 2 times. So in Genesis 22, God asked the ultimate request from Abraham in giving his only son Isaac as a sacrifice. As Abraham was proving his obedience to God, the angel of the Lord called his name twice and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he subsequently passed that test and moved into a new dimension of relationship with God. In Exodus 3 and 4, God calls out of the burning bush to Moses, and God said, Moses, Moses. And Moses answered, he said, Here am I. God then proceeded to introduce himself to Moses as I am the God of thy father Abraham, God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I have seen the affliction of my people. I know their sorrows, and I am come to deliver them. Then God says to Moses, he says, Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, and I will be with you. When you have brought them out of Egypt, you will serve me. I am that I am. Moses was no longer a flock keeper for Jethro. He had been called. He had been called into a new relationship with God. In Genesis 46:2, God calls Jacob's name twice. God called him and said, Jacob, Jacob, and he replied, Here am I. And God said to him, I will make of thee a great nation. Go down into Egypt without fear. So this was when they were in famine, and he knew Joseph was in Egypt. And he's telling him, he's like, go down into Egypt without fear, because there is where I'm going to make of you a great nation. So he's sending Jacob into a place that is not his homeland. And he goes, when you travel into Egypt, that's where I'm going to make of you a great nation. And Jacob was a man with 12 sons, but when God called him twice, he was then made the father of 12 tribes. In Samuel 3:1-10, God calls Samuel's name twice, and actually 3 times. At Eli's advice, he replies with, Speak, Lord, your servant hears. God called Samuel to be his spokesperson, his mouth to his people, and warned Samuel to know that when the people rejected Samuel's words, that they were in fact rejecting God himself. Jesus calls Martha's name twice, not because she was in the wrong. Hospitality is biblical. Jesus was calling Martha to realize that worship and proximity to Jesus is the good part of service. He was calling Martha to join in that sacred moment that would prove to precede the day of crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. He was essentially saying, what Mary is doing may not be conventional, but it's timely. Come join. Because when Mary anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, there was a pushback from Judas, remember? And he was like, oh, we could sell this for, give to the poor. And, the whole time he's stealing. But Jesus said, don't condemn her. She's doing this for my burial. And so even though that little phrase escaped the people that were sitting around, Mary had this gratitude in her heart, and it probably overflowed from the fact that her brother, who had been dead, was sitting at the table with them to partake of this meal. And whatever reason that her gratitude was overflowing, and maybe she didn't understand exactly why she was worshiping Jesus, but she was, and she felt the desire to do that, and she felt a pull to come and sit at his feet. And it was such a strong pull that she was willing to step over cultural boundaries that were uncrossable at that time. Simon was called twice by Jesus in Luke 22:31-32, letting him know that even though Satan desires to sift him as wheat, scatter him, and break him apart, Jesus tells him, he says, I have prayed for you that your faith doesn't fail. And when you are converted, when that day comes, when you see things clearly and you understand who I am, that you will in turn strengthen your brethren. So Simon at that time, even though he was, following Jesus and, loved him, he didn't fully have that, full grasp of, what he would be turning the world upside down about. And Jesus called him, he said, Simon, Simon, Satan wants to tear you apart and pick you apart and scatter you to the 4 winds. He said, but I've prayed for you. Saul was a zealous Pharisee who had been killing Christians. He was on his way to Damascus with a letter in hand that gave him permission to arrest and imprison anybody that followed Christ. Saul is confronted by the light of God, the risen Christ, and is called, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Jesus called Saul from his old life to become Paul, one of the greatest evangelists to the Gentiles and a writer of the large portion of the New Testament. The calling of a name twice, instead of a scolding, indicates the deep relationship or a call to a deep or deeper relationship. It suggests a prior intimate knowing of the one being addressed. We can conclude that calling a name twice suggests a partnership or the desire to establish a partnership or closer connection. Lastly, in Psalms 22, we see a song written by David, prophetically so. David was said to be a man after God's own heart, so he had a relationship with God. This particular song in Psalms 22 begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? And why are you so far from the sound of my roaring words?" David was even though he knew God very intimately and he worshiped him and he revered him and he was quick to repent and quick to humble himself, there was times when he felt this deep isolation, which caused him to write this prophetic, beautifully prophetic Psalms 22. So even in his sorrow, David reverts to his commitment to praise and to declare God's righteousness for generations to come. So if you go and you read the entirety of Psalms 22, yes, he starts out with my God, why have you forsaken me? But by the end of it, he's in full praise and worship to God. At Calvary, Jesus is singing this same song. A lot of times it's been, translated like, Jesus is accusing God of turning his back on him. But in essence, he's singing this same song that David wrote so long ago. Jesus was not accusing God of abandoning him. He was singing the song of David that begins in sorrow and ends in praise. It was a song of intimate knowing. My God, he knew him and he had an intimate relationship with him and he could talk to him in this way, this familiar way. Jesus was singing about the unity and the purpose of the cross, the blood and the everlasting covenant between God and man. When God calls us twice, he's not calling us by our first and middle name or scolding us for our busyness or for our commitment to serve him in any way possible. He's calling us to his feet. He's calling us into a plan for growth, for reaching souls, for setting those captives free, for being a speaker of his truth, or for a test of our loyalty to him. May we hear him call us twice. The way we hear him call us twice is in proximity, as Mary's sitting at his feet, listening, as Samuel did, waking up in the night and hearing the Lord, not knowing, going to his spiritual mentor and saying, hey, I hear someone's called my name, what do you need? And then he heeded the advice of Eli and said, Lord, here I am. So Jesus calls twice, and in love, in knowing and in a longing to know us more. It's his way of saying, I see you, I want you to see me. I want you to see yourself as I see you. So I hope this was an encouragement to you, and I just encourage you that if you do feel like you're in a place where maybe there's some isolation or maybe there's a lack of direction or you feel a bit overwhelmed or left behind or unseen, invisible in the busyness of the day-to-day and your obligations and the things that you feel like you can't push aside, to find a quiet place, even if it's in your heart, in the middle of whatever it is that you're doing. Instead of having your mind focus on the next thing, take a moment and quiet your heart, quiet your mind, and listen and allow God to speak to your heart, because He's ever present. He's always with us, and if you have a broken heart, He's even more near to you than usual. It says He's near to those that have a broken heart. So I encourage you to find a place that is at the feet of Jesus as Mary, or in a quiet moment in the middle of the night, and listen for God to call you twice. I hope this was an encouragement, and if it was, please share it with someone, and I look forward to being with y'all soon, and God bless.